Hey guys, before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any feedback. Let's go to the story. Looking back, I can't believe how long it took me to understand what my childhood really was. For years, I convinced myself that my parents were just overwhelmed and that my sister's behavior was just part of growing up. I thought if I tried harder, stayed quieter, and made myself less of a problem, things would eventually get better. They never did. By the time I walked away, I wasn't just leaving home. I was leaving behind a life where I had never truly belonged. Having an older sister should have meant having someone to look up to. Instead, every day felt like walking through a minefield. Rose had a way of making every space hers. Nothing was ever truly mine. The TV, the games, even my own clothes, if she wanted them, they were hers. Any attempt to set boundaries was met with relentless pestering until I gave in. It was exhausting, but refusing her demands only made things worse. At first, she resorted to manipulation. She'd tell my parents I was being selfish, that I wasn't sharing. If that didn't work, she escalated. Hiding or breaking my things, taking whatever mattered to me just to prove she could. Each time I complained, the response was always the same: she doesn't mean it. That phrase followed me throughout my entire childhood. One of the earliest memories that stuck with me was the year I saved up for a new backpack. It wasn't expensive, but it was the first thing I had truly earned on my own. The day before school started, I came home to find Rose cutting the straps off. She didn't care that I had spent months waiting for it. She simply shrugged and said, "I didn't like the color." I ran to my parents, expecting them to be furious. They barely reacted. My mom sighed and said, "Just let it go." That was the moment I understood. Nothing that belonged to me would ever be mine. As the years passed, I stopped expecting fairness. Rose's outbursts were unpredictable, and my parents always found a way to excuse them. If she didn't like the dinner my mom made, the entire meal was thrown out. If she wanted to take over my birthday, I was told to let her. If she ruined something that belonged to me, I was expected to accept it and move on. It was never about what was right or fair. It was about keeping Rose happy, no matter the cost. By the time I turned 13, I had learned to shrink into the background. I made myself as invisible as possible, hoping that if I stayed quiet, if I never asked for anything, life would be easier. That year, I let myself believe things could be different. I had one request for my birthday, a weekend away, just my parents and me. No distractions, no chaos, just time alone with them. At first, they agreed. They even booked the hotel. I let myself feel excited, thinking I had finally been given something of my own. The moment Rose found out, everything changed. She screamed, threw things, and accused me of trying to take our parents away from her. My mom and dad immediately tried to calm her down, but nothing worked. They came to me afterward, looking exhausted. "We can't just leave her behind. She wouldn't handle it well." They didn't say it outright, but I understood what they were asking. If I wanted to keep the peace, I had to let her come. I didn't argue. There was no point. The trip was ruined before it even started. Rose dictated everything: the schedule, where we ate, when we left. She made a fuss at the theme park, so we barely stayed. That night, she decided she didn't like the hotel, and my parents caved, cutting the trip short. The next morning, we packed up and left. My dad patted my shoulder as if that would fix it. "We'll try again next year." There was no next year. By the time I was 17, I had stopped hoping for anything to change. I focused on what mattered: getting out. Every spare moment was spent applying to colleges, saving every bit of money I could. I kept quiet, went along with whatever they wanted, and didn't give them a reason to suspect what I was planning. Then my parents found out. I expected them to be upset. I expected some guilt tripping. What I didn't expect was what came next. They didn't just want me to stay. They expected me to take care of Rose. Forever. Sitting at the kitchen table, listening to them talk like this was normal. I struggled to process what they were saying. "Rose needs you. She won't be able to manage on her own." It didn't even sound like a conversation. It sounded like a decision that had already been made. I asked why. Why was this my responsibility? My mom looked at me like I was being ridiculous. "Because that's why we had you." The words hit harder than I expected. I had always known, deep down, that I came second to Rose. But hearing it out loud made something shift in me. I wasn't their child. I was their backup plan. I don't remember much after that. I just remember getting up and leaving the room. Something inside me had clicked. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to plead my case. I was just going to leave. And when that day came, I walked out of the house without a word. No dramatic confrontation. No final fight. Just the quiet understanding that I would never come back. And for the first time, that silence belonged to me. Leaving wasn't just about escaping. It was about survival. For years, I had lived in a house where my needs didn't matter. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment revolved around Rose. The thought of spending my entire life in that cycle, trapped as her caretaker, was unbearable. So I left. Not in anger. Not in a fit of rebellion. Just silently. I packed my bags the night before and walked out the next morning. No grand goodbyes, no dramatic confrontation, just the certainty that whatever was waiting for me outside that house had to be better than what I was leaving behind. And I was right. At first, I expected pushback. I had imagined my parents trying to call, begging me to reconsider, demanding that I fulfill the role they had decided for me. But the silence that followed was louder than any argument. Weeks passed, and I heard nothing. No messages. No calls. Not even a passive-aggressive email. They had spent years reminding me of my responsibility to Rose. But the second they realized I wouldn't play my part, they erased me. That should have hurt. But all I felt was relief. Starting over wasn't easy. I had no safety net, no backup plan. Every bill, every meal, every mistake, I was on my own. And yet, for the first time in my life, I was free. College was different from anything I had known. There were no rules built around someone else's comfort and no expectations to sacrifice my time and energy for another person's needs. I wasn't walking on eggshells, anticipating the next demand, the next outburst. I was just living. I made friends. I worked odd jobs to keep myself afloat. I learned how to be independent and how to build something for myself without waiting for permission. And the more time passed, the more I realized something important. I didn't miss them. Not my parents. Not Rose. Not the life I had left behind. 3 years passed before I heard from them again. I had almost convinced myself that they had forgotten about me entirely, that I had been cut out of their world, the same way I had cut them out of mine. But people like my parents don't reach out unless they want something. And sure enough, the moment my phone lit up with my mother's name, I knew this wasn't a reunion call. She wasn't calling to check on me. She was calling because she needed me. At first, I considered ignoring it. I had built a life without them, one that didn't revolve around their demands. But part of me was curious. So I answered. My mother's voice was tight, controlled. The same tone she used when she wanted to pretend everything was fine. It's been a long time. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't acknowledge the fact that 3 years had passed without a single word. She got straight to the point. Rose is struggling. Of course. Things hadn't been going well since I left. Rose had never learned to take care of herself, and with me gone, my parents had been forced to handle the reality they had spent years avoiding. They thought she would grow out of it. That one day, she'd wake up and become independent. But without me there to absorb the damage, without someone to blame when things didn't go her way, they had been forced to experience the full weight of what they had created. She's having a really hard time, my mother continued, her voice dipping into something dangerously close to guilt-tripping. We think it would be good for her if you came back. There it was. The real reason for the call. I let her finish, let her spin her words into a carefully crafted plea. Then I said the one thing I had never allowed myself to say before. That's not my problem. She was silent for a moment. Then she let out a breath, like I had disappointed her. You don't mean that. She's your sister. And the words sat between us, heavy with everything I had never said. And you have a responsibility. No, I don't. For years, I had been told that it was my duty to put Rose first. That family meant sacrifice. That my wants, my needs, my entire future were secondary to her comfort. But I didn't owe them anything. And for the first time, I was done pretending that I did. My mother tried a different approach, switching tactics so fast it almost gave me whiplash. We miss you. A pause. A carefully calculated silence. Your father misses you. A few years ago, that might have worked. The thought of my father, usually so quiet, so passive, actually wanting me to come home might have broken me. But not anymore. If he missed me, he could have reached out. If he cared, he wouldn't have let me leave without a fight. I have to go, I said, already done with the conversation. You can't just walk away from your family, she snapped, finally letting the mask slip. I already did. And with that, I ended the call. For a long time, I sat there, phone still in my hand, waiting for the regret to hit. But it never did. I wasn't a bad person for leaving. I wasn't cruel for choosing myself for once. I had spent years giving them every piece of me. And now, it was my turn to live. On my terms. Without them. Rebuilding a life without them was easier than I expected. At first, I thought the absence would feel like a hole, something I'd have to fill with distractions or new routines. But the reality was quieter, simpler. The weight of their expectations was gone, and in its place was something I had never truly experienced before: freedom. For the first time, I didn't have to answer to anyone. There were no forced obligations, no expectations to drop everything for someone else's needs. My time, my choices, my future, it was all mine. And I wasn't going to waste a second of it. The call from my mother didn't linger in my mind the way I thought it would. I had spent so many years bracing myself for her words, waiting for the inevitable guilt to pull me back in. But it never came. Instead, life continued. I threw myself into work, into building something real. Every milestone, every promotion, every new opportunity felt like proof that I had made the right decision. There was no space for regret. I had done what I had to do, and they had to live with it. Months passed, and then a year. I heard nothing from them. The silence was expected, but it still caught me off guard. I had spent my entire life believing they would always have a hold on me, that no matter how far I went, they would find a way to drag me back. But they didn't. Not yet, at least. It wasn't until my birthday that the next message came. An email. Short. Formal. Almost like it had been written by someone who wasn't sure how to speak to me anymore. We hope you're doing well. Your sister would like to reconnect. Please think about it. No greeting. No apology. Just a request. Or maybe a demand. Either way, it wasn't happening. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry or even because I wanted to make a point. I just didn't care. For years, I had been the one expected to bridge the gap, to fix what was broken, even when I wasn't the one who had shattered it. Not anymore. If they wanted to reconnect, they could do it on my terms. And my terms were simple. They had to acknowledge what they had done. They had to take responsibility. And they had to understand that I wasn't walking back into that house as the person they had once controlled. But that wasn't going to happen. Because for people like them, acknowledging the past meant admitting they had been wrong. And they would never do that. Another year passed. I got engaged, built a home, started shaping the life I had once thought was impossible. And with each new step, the memories of my family faded into the background. Until the next email arrived. This time, it wasn't just from my mother. It was from Rose. Her words were carefully chosen, just like my mother's had been. I know we had our differences growing up. I know I wasn't the best sister. But things are different now, and I'd really like to talk. The shift in tone was obvious. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't playing the victim. She was trying to act like we were long-lost siblings, like we had simply drifted apart and could patch things up with a phone call. She wanted to pretend the past didn't matter. And that was the problem. Because it did. I didn't reply right away. I thought about it. Considered what she had written, what she had left out. There was no apology. No accountability. Just an attempt to rewrite history into something more palatable. And I wasn't interested. So I closed the email. And deleted it. There was no anger in my decision. No bitterness. Just clarity. I had spent my entire life trying to be someone worth loving in their eyes. But the truth was, I had been worth it all along. They were just never capable of seeing it. And I wasn't going to spend another second waiting for them to change. That night, as I sat beside the person who had chosen me, not out of obligation, not because they needed something, but simply because they wanted me in their life, I felt something I had never felt in that house. Peace. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Not now. Not ever. Life moved forward, and I kept moving with it. For years, I had lived with the expectation that my past would always be a shadow following me, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. But the longer I stayed away, the more I realized that shadow only had power if I let it. The messages from my mother and Rose stopped. Whether it was out of frustration or acceptance, I didn't know. And I didn't care. I had built something real for myself. A life where I wasn't defined by my role in someone else's story. That should have been the end of it. But then, out of nowhere, they found a new way to drag me back in. It started with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I rarely answered unknown calls, but something in me hesitated. A part of me still expected it to be them. I let it go to voicemail, half expecting to hear my mother's voice when I played it back. Instead, it was a lawyer. A formal tone. A carefully measured message. I'm calling regarding a matter involving your family. Please reach out at your earliest convenience. A cold weight settled in my stomach. They weren't reaching out to apologize. They were making this official. I didn't return the call right away. Instead, I sat with it. Thought about what it could mean. There was no way they could sue me for leaving. I had done nothing wrong. So what did they want? The only way to find out was to face it head on. When I finally called back, the lawyer's assistant put me through immediately. Your parents have named you in their estate planning. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. I hadn't spoken to them in years. They had treated me like a stranger, ignored my existence, until they needed something. They would like you to take legal responsibility for Rose in the event of their passing. There it was. The final trap. They had spent my whole life preparing me for this role. The caretaker. The backup plan. The person who would pick up where they left off. When I left, they must have convinced themselves that time would wear me down, that eventually I would come crawling back. That didn't happen. So now, they were trying to put it in writing. Make it legally binding. Erase my choice. The lawyer must have noticed my silence because he cleared his throat before continuing. If you agree, the process is straightforward. I don't agree. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I have no obligation to them. I will not take on responsibility for Rose. They have no right to assume otherwise. Would you like to submit a formal statement rejecting the role? Yes. There was nothing left to discuss. The documents arrived a few days later. I read through them carefully, my stomach turning as I took in the details. They hadn't just named me as a guardian. They had tied financial responsibilities to it. If I accepted, I wouldn't just be overseeing Rose's care. I would be expected to provide for her, fund her life, continue the cycle they had spent decades forcing me into. They had planned for this. Planned for me to have no way out. They were wrong. I signed the rejection and sent it back without a second thought. It wasn't just about cutting ties. It was about making sure they never had the power to control me again. The moment the paperwork was finalized, I felt something shift inside me. This time, there were no lingering doubts. No guilt. Just the certainty that I had made the right choice. I didn't hear from them again. Not directly, at least. But a week later, my cousin sent me a message. You need to see this. Attached was a post from my mother's social media. A carefully worded paragraph about family betrayal. We raised our children with love. We sacrificed everything for them. And in the end, one of them turned their back on us when we needed them the most. It wasn't directed at me by name. But it didn't have to be. The comments were filled with sympathy. Distant relatives, old family friends, and even people I barely remembered, all offered words of support. Some people forget where they come from. Parents give everything, and this is how they're repaid? They'll regret it one day. I should have been angry. Instead, I just closed the app. Their words meant nothing to me. For years, I had let their expectations define me. Not anymore. I had made my choice. And no matter how much they tried to twist the story out, I wasn't coming back. Rejecting the legal responsibility for Rose should have been the final step. I had made my position clear. There was nothing left for them to demand. Nothing was left for them to take. But people like my parents don't accept rejection. They don't reflect. They retaliate. And when they realized they couldn't legally force me into their plan, they tried a different tactic, public shame. At first, it was just whispers. Relatives reaching out with thinly veiled concern. Your parents are going through a rough time. You don't have to agree with them, but maybe hear them out? Family is complicated. None of them were outright accusing me of anything. Not yet. But they were testing the waters, waiting to see if guilt still worked on me. It didn't. Then the messages became direct. One after another, people who had barely acknowledged me over the years suddenly had so much to say. You broke your mother's heart. They did everything for you, and this is how you repay them? You abandoned your sister. The words should have stung. A younger version of me would have let them sink in. Would have started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was the villain in this story. But I had done nothing wrong. Choosing myself wasn't abandonment. Refusing to be a pawn in their plan wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Sarah noticed the shift before I even mentioned it. One evening, as we sat on the couch, she glanced at my phone and sighed. They're trying to drag you back in. I nodded, setting the phone down. It's not working. Are you sure? She wasn't accusing me of anything. She was just asking gently if I was okay. And the answer? Yeah, I am. The next week, my parents made one last attempt to break my silence. A letter. Not a text. Not an email. An actual, handwritten letter delivered to my house. When I saw the envelope with my mother's handwriting, I nearly threw it away without opening it. But curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded the paper and started reading. It was everything I expected. A long, dramatic recounting of their sacrifices. A plea for me to remember where I came from. A final, desperate push to make me feel like the villain. We don't understand how you became so heartless. You weren't raised this way. One day, when we're gone, you'll regret this. Nothing about why I left. Nothing about what they had done. Just an attempt to rewrite history into something that suited them. And I wasn't interested in playing along. I placed the letter back in the envelope, walked over to the trash, and dropped it in. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just one final, quiet rejection. Because this wasn't my burden anymore. Whatever guilt they wanted me to carry, it belonged to them, not me. That night, as I sat outside, the weight I had once carried felt distant, almost unrecognizable. I had spent so many years thinking freedom was something I had to fight for, something I had to constantly defend. But it wasn't. Freedom wasn't about winning battles or proving a point. It was simply about choosing peace. And for the first time, I had done exactly that. The letter was the last move they had left. They had tried everything: guilt, legal action, social pressure. Each attempt had failed. Now, they had nothing. And for the first time, I think they knew it. Because after I threw that letter away, the silence stretched longer than it ever had before. No calls. No emails. No flying monkeys were sent to break me down. Just peace. And I wasn't about to waste it. For years, I had lived under the weight of their expectations, their demands, their unspoken rules. Even after leaving, a part of me had still been bracing for impact, waiting for the next way they would try to pull me back in. But this time, they had no cards left to play. And with every day that passed, I felt lighter. Life moved forward in ways I had never thought possible. Sarah and I focused on our future, making plans that weren't built around obligation or fear. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up to me. Because the past had finally stopped chasing me, and I wasn't about to invite it back in. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from Aunt Linda. She was one of the few family members who had never tried to push me back toward my parents. She had stayed neutral, never taking sides but never pressuring me either. Your mom and dad are selling the house. I read the words twice, letting them settle. The house where I had spent my entire childhood. The place I had run from. The place that had once felt like a cage. I thought I would feel something, but I didn't. It wasn't my home anymore. It never had been. I sent a short response. Hope they find what they're looking for. That was all. Because the truth was, their struggles were no longer my concern. Whatever mess they had created for themselves, whatever consequences they were now facing, I wasn't responsible for fixing it. They had made their choices. And so had I. That night, Sarah and I sat outside, watching the city lights stretch in the distance. She glanced over at me. You okay? I nodded. Yeah, I am. I meant it. The past no longer held power over me. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's expectations, shouldering burdens that were never mine to bear. But standing here now, looking at the life I had built without them, I realized something important. I had one. Not in a way that involved revenge or proving a point. I had one simply by choosing myself. And nothing they did could take that away from me. Months passed. My parents sold the house and moved into something smaller. The life they had built around control and manipulation had finally collapsed in on itself, and I wasn't there to pick up the pieces. A part of me wondered if they expected me to reach out, to offer them some kind of closure. But I didn't, because they weren't my responsibility. They never had been. One evening, as Sarah and I sat outside watching the sky fade into deep shades of orange and red, she reached for my hand. It's over, isn't it? I squeezed her fingers lightly, considering the words. Yeah, it is. And the best part? I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel guilt. I just felt free. A few years ago, I thought that walking away meant losing something. But I hadn't lost a family. I had gained a life. One where I didn't have to constantly fight for a place that was never meant for me. One where I could finally exist without asking for permission. And that was more than enough.